Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our panel discussion. I am joined here today by three wonderful therapists who I have been in touch with over the years. They have all been learning the innate rhythmic movements and reflex integration, and I'm super happy that they are here to share some of their experiences. I'm very grateful. So, can you guys say hi? This is Linda Speed, Melody Edwards, and Carrie Eskenazi. And I'm going to share a little bit of a very brief introduction, and then we're going to focus on their stories and their experiences using these tools with the children and adults that they work with. And so I have prepared some slides. I'm going to put them up right now. But just to give a little introduction very briefly, Carrie is a speech language pathologist, Melody is a physical therapist, and Linda is an occupational therapist. All right, welcome everyone. I am a movement educator and I developed the Brain and Sensory Foundations curriculum. I've written an evidence ebook with supporting research rationale and the relevance of why this work is important to our children, but also for any age and for many different modalities. So we have three represented here with our discussion, and there are more individuals that use this work for a variety of reasons. I love this work, and I developed these tools to help parents initially. I didn't know that I would eventually be working with therapists, but many therapists sought out the training because they found it to be very useful. And then I have been blessed with just learning so much from the therapists that got to take the Brain and Sensory Foundations training and report back to me their stories. So again, thank you to our panelists, and I'm going to start with talking about what neurodevelopmental movements are, because that is the basis of the training that these three individuals are going to be talking about. So neurodevelopmental movements are the hardwired movement program that comes with babies. So they're part of our development, they're innate, spontaneous, and as long as a baby is healthy and developing well, then the baby will do these movements, and they're crucial for the maturity of the brain, the body, and the sensory systems. So these movements start in the womb and they go throughout infancy and toddlerhood. Some of them are rhythmic movements, so we call them innate rhythmic movements or just rhythmic movements. Some of them are very familiar, like sucking, crawling, kicking. The one where you press a baby's hand and they grasp, that is another innate movement. And that is a reflex. That's a primitive reflex. There are also postural reflexes that we work with. And then there are developmental movements, which are also familiar, things like rolling over, sitting up, crawling, those kinds of things. So that's what neurodevelopmental movements are. Tonight we'll probably focus mostly on rhythmic movements and primitive reflexes. So a little bit more about these rhythmic movements, because they're less familiar, is that they, like primitive and postural reflexes, they're essential to development. And this fun little graphic here are all the different systems that these rhythmic movements impact. So they're crucial for our sensory processing, our brain and nervous system development, body development, and they actually are the foundation for our reflex development and for our developmental movements. They're also very calming. We had a funny thing before we started. Linda was sharing with me when she first did these rhythmic movements with her husband, he said, "Wow, I feel like I've just taken Benadryl." So Linda was making me laugh before we started here. But yes, they're very calming and relaxing. And they're associated with bursts in development and in speech development. So that's a little bit about the rhythmic movements. And then for those of you who are familiar with primitive reflex integration, you know already, but those who may not know, when they're not fully mature, in other words, when they haven't had their full cycle, when they haven't had their full ability to develop, it's associated with physical, social, emotional, and cognitive deficits. And what I mean by that in terms of full development is that these primitive reflexes, ideally, we see them very active in the womb and birth and early infancy, and they help the baby survive. They're there for protection, survival, and the baby's first exercise program. They grow the nervous system and they help the baby manage with gravity. And so they do so much, and they're the key movements along with the rhythmic movements to get a baby from not being able to self-propel to be able to move, and then also to be able to walk and eventually run. So this is the foundational movement program that human beings come with. They should, at least with the primitive reflexes, they should go away over time, within most of them within that first year. They should be really active at first and then gradually fade away. And that's the meaning of that little curve that you see there on the graph. But if they don't go through that process, then they're said to be retained or unintegrated and or active. They're still active when they should be dormant. That is associated with many challenges. They're considered neurological soft signs. And so what we do is we give these movements to all ages of individuals, and they really help promote a more optimal development. And just to give you an idea of the need for this is we know from research and also from observation that children are not growing out of these motor deficits that we see in infancy. So you can see at the left there at the top, there's babies who are very slumped, which is not ideal. They should be more upright and aligned. But there's babies who are slumped, that goes on to school children, which are slumped, and then teenagers and adults. And you can see on the slide there that out of 120 school children, this was a study done in the UK fairly recently, these children between the ages of 4 and 5, only 3 had no sign of a motor abnormality. So this is something that we can really use for so many children, not just the children with obvious diagnoses, obvious severe challenges, but we're seeing across the board that this is beneficial for all the children. And then again, we talked about that when these reflexes did not go through their full maturity and development, they're called retained. It's associated with all these different physical challenges, challenges with balance, coordination, gross motor, fine motor, abnormal walking, and visual skills deficits. So we know that from research and also observation. Also, here's one thing that there's research about that I thought can tie this together. So this slide is talking about how when the reflexes are retained, there are challenges with social emotional issues. And a piece of research that I thought was so fascinating, and this goes for adults and children, is when there is poor balance, poor physical balance, there's also anxiety. They go hand in hand. So when we can help children with their physical balance, their anxiety levels get lower and their self-esteem goes higher. And I love that research because that's exactly what we see. We see better balance, and then we see less anxiety and higher self-esteem with these movements. So you can see that when we help these reflexes go through that maturity, that you can get better outcomes, not just in physical, but in social, emotional realms and in cognitive, which we're going to get to. But I just wanted to share, this is another study, also with 120 children. These children were ages 3 to 8. They did not have a diagnosed neurological disability, but they still showed that almost 90% had retained primitive reflexes. So these are areas of the nervous system that aren't working optimally that we can help. And that's just another thing that's showing that this is very widespread. Last slide here for the moment is that these retained primitive reflexes are also associated with cognitive challenges and reading, writing, mathematics, developmental language disorder, and ADHD. And that's very clear in the research. The other thing that's so interesting to me is that there is a lot of research about how ADHD has comorbidity with all these other challenges. So I call them co-occurring challenges. And things like sensory challenges, motor challenges, brain immaturity, learning challenges, anxiety, and headaches. All of these things, there is preliminary research showing that when we help the primitive reflexes, when we use them and help them to be mature, that it helps with all these challenges. And that is very exciting. So with that, I'd like to talk to our panelists so they can share their experiences with you. And our first panelist is Linda Steed. Linda has 31 years of experience. Linda, when we first started talking, you had 24 years of experience. So now you have so much more. And she has been doing occupational therapy and has worked across pediatrics and adult care, supporting individuals in developmental preschools, public schools, outpatient clinics, and now in a habilitation setting for adults with developmental delays. So that is a vast number of years of experience, but also in many different settings, which I think is fascinating. And Linda's passion lies in sensory processing and enhancing quality of life through personalized functional interventions. So, Linda, what got you into learning about the reflexes and rhythmic movements, and how do you, like, if I were to ask you, what would you tell another OT about this? What would you say?
Yes. I love with the reflex integration and rhythmic movements for sensory processing. As an OT, so in the different settings where I've worked, sometimes it's hard to get the equipment I needed to do sensory processing the way I learned in school and other courses. But with the rhythmic movements, it is the most ideal sensory integration program because it does not require any special equipment. It's very easy to learn and teach, staff and parents to get carryover in their home environments or their developmental preschools or their adult habilitation setting. And it has really made something that used to be so hard to teach and get carryover and easy. And then oftentimes I would see immediate differences, with this because I always will do a task, that's written in our plan of care and see what it's like before. And then I'll have the client that I'm working with, I mostly worked in the preschools with 3, 4, 5-year-olds and then school age kids. And now I'm with adults with developmental delays that are 18 plus. And so I'll have them pick the movements and then we'll go back and repeat the same task. And I would say 90% of the time, it is much better, easier, and automatic. And so then it's reinforcing to them and empowering. So this is the best sensory integration tool I have in my tool chest. And I love it. I've benefited from it with myself. Our family members, we get to practice on them when we learn new techniques. And so my daughter and my husband, they also like the movements. I just love it. It's made sensory regulation easier, handwriting easier, balance easier, sitting in their chairs when they're supposed to easier, sitting at the table to eat meals easier. And it just takes the stress out of a lot of daily activities and no special equipment. So as an OT, we have to carry our supplies with us place to place if we travel. This doesn't require anything.
Yeah. Oh, that's so wonderful. I'm really curious about when you were sharing, Linda, about how you have, your client doing a task and then you do some of the movements and then you go back to the task.
Yes.
About how much time are you doing those movements where you can see, because you said 90% of the time you see there's positive gain where it's easier or somehow better.
If I do the rhythmic movements, where we're laying down and doing the rocking, that's usually 5 minutes or less. Sometimes with handwriting, when that's the task, I'll do the hand integration reflexes, and so that's 2 minutes or less. And it's so interesting to see because then they feel so empowered because, the vestibular system works the way, much better and efficiently and automatically, the proprioceptive system, the tactile system. just coordinating the eyes and hands together. So usually 5 minutes or less, whereas before, I'm swinging for 5 to 10 minutes, and then they're jumping and climbing. And then some of the children that I would work with would get more, overstimulated and have a hard time coming down.
Right.
But this is just, 5 minutes or less. And then you can see, a noticeable difference. And it's not like it stays the same. Then we're training the system to retain this skill. But handwriting, and I'll even do it to my colleagues, because, even some of the people that I've worked with after I've been to courses, they think it's voodoo. So I'll just have them, my colleagues, when I'm wanting to get them to do it too, I'll have them write their name, and they know how to write their name. They sign, before electronic paperwork, they signed it all the time. So they'll write their name, and then we'll do quick, hand Babkin and Palmer integration, and then they'll write their name again. It's always smaller, less pressure, and faster, and they'll notice it. So then they're curious, and they're like, oh, wow, and then they're open-minded, and they want to do more. And I'll even do that with, just some of the teachers and some parents. And then there's motor tasks that we do too, aside from handwriting, like being able to apply enough pressure to keep your feet on the pedals and pedal a tricycle. With my adults, they sit down, they have a hard time bending over to get their shoes. And so I work in a gym now with PT and speech. And so, some of our clients, they just get really, really stiff, and they can't bend down and get their shoes. And a lot of them have orthotics, and they just can't access their feet. And so we'll do the rhythmic movements, have them try to reach down, pick something off the floor, or get their shoes, and they can't, 3 to 5 minutes or less of the rhythmic movements, and then they're bending down and they're able to do it. Still need some of the times they'll need a little bit of help pulling their shoe over the back of their heel, but it's just amazing that something, because their systems just start working together. They have better sensory integration, better motor output. And then the people I work with, then they can see that and they're intrigued.
Yeah, it's so funny. It is really interesting how you can see if you're paying attention, and if you do those bookends like you're doing. Let's do a task. Now let's do 5 minutes of rhythmic movements, and then let's do the same task. It's so fun. And I love that you've really taken that and run with it in so many fun ways, and even with your colleagues, because it really does make a difference. And I love it when the kids feel it too, and they see it.
Yes.
And then, because then, they get excited, like they feel successful. And to me, that is wonderful. And that's actually one of my favorite quotes that you that came out of an earlier video that you and I did together 7 years ago. You said, I'm helping kids experience success like I've never seen.
Yes.
And that was so exciting to me. And I love the part about how, when I first started, I was so excited about these reflexes because I had felt them in my own body. They were so helpful for me. And I just wanted to share that with everybody. And I also learned the rhythmic movements, which I didn't realize how powerful they were until it was actually OTs who taught me, because they would come back and say, this is the most effective set of tools we have for sensory processing. And I thought, well, why is that? And then I realized, like, oh, it makes so much sense, because these are the foundation, these movements, the rhythmic movements plus the reflexes, they're how the sensory system develops in the first place. So it makes sense that they would be so impactful for sensory integration, because it's like hardwired into us for these to work for those specific things, because that's how they develop in the first place. And then I was like, okay, I got it. And I just love how much fun you've been having with this, and all the souls that you're helping in so many ways. So,
and then I was, looking at your slides about the social and emotional piece of this, and it just made me think of a little boy that I worked with when he was in preschool. Very smart little boy, had an amazing vocabulary. Some words in there that we wouldn't want to hear from a 4-year-old, but he just was very dysregulated, had a lot of emotional and behavioral problems. And so I remember I went to go get out of his classroom for his session, and his teacher said that, he had been acting out and they were possibly going to have to send him home because he was just, they couldn't control him and keep him safe and the other kids safe. So we brought him down to the therapy room. I showed him the pictures of the rhythmic movements, and he had done them before. So they were familiar to him, and he picked the ones he did. And as we're doing the movements, then he starts saying that his dad had left the home.
Oh,
His dad had been incarcerated, and I guess he was there when the police came to take his dad. And so then after the little bit of the movements, instead of acting out, then all of a sudden he could retrieve, those words that he had, and he could just say, he was sad that his dad had left. So then I was able to go to his teachers and just let them know, what had happened. So then they could kind of set up the environment for more success and give him a little bit more grace.
yeah.
But I just thought that was so amazing because he had such, social, emotional, and behavioral regulation issues, but just a little bit of the movements. And then he was able to connect, and access those words so we could understand how to help him.
Yeah, that is a beautiful story. It reminds me because I was trained in the rhythmic movements by Dr. Blomberg, who's a psychiatrist, and he said that the movements really help us get in touch with our emotions, which is very important for any kind of healing. And he worked with psychiatric patients and he also worked with children with challenges. So, yeah, your story is beautiful. And there's a lot of research showing that when the reflexes are not integrated, it is associated with even severe emotional and behavioral
Mhm.
challenges. There are so many stories like what you just shared, and we have a lot of case studies that people are interested in this on our website. There's a whole index of case studies, so that's exciting. Well, thank you, Linda, for sharing. Are there any last things you would like to share?
Well, this is just a random tidbit, but I told you now I work in an adult setting in a room full of therapists. And so as I'm helping, some of our consumers pick up, do their movements, some of my colleagues will say, I do that. Oh, I do that to go to sleep. And so they, instead of it just looking strange to them, they identify with it. And now I get to tell them, well, this is why you do it, and so
Yeah. Oh, that is so
interesting.
wonderful. That comes up a lot. That is another thing that the movements are very well known. It's very common that we hear they help with sleep. So, and even children have trouble sleeping, especially if
Yeah,
their moral reflexes
yeah.
is active and not dormant like it should be. They're startling and having difficulty sleeping, falling asleep, or staying asleep.
Yeah.
And we know that that tends to be something that happens as we get older too.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a good thing to have these tools. Well, thanks so much for
You're
everything that you
welcome.
shared, Linda. And we're going to move to our next panelist,
All
which
right.
is Melody. Melody is our star physical therapist. I was so happy when Melody finally retired because I hired her the minute I could. And Melody works for us now as a movement educator. She helps me when we do live Q&As, and she also helps answer some of our student questions. She is passionate about sharing the value of using innate rhythmic movements and reflex integration with individuals of all ages to improve quality of life. And Melody's been a physical therapist since 1980. I was trying to do the math in my head, Melody, and I'm like, she looks way too young for that.
Yeah.
But anyway, Melody is also an expert at resolving infant torticollis and using gentle and playful rhythmic and reflex integration activities with no painful stretching, which is very exciting. Melody, what would you like to share if you were able to say how this work is applicable to the field of physical therapy and anything that you want to share, any stories or things that you would share with your colleagues? I know you're retired from PT now, but you have a massive set of tools and experience. So what would you share with your fellow PTs?
Thank you, Sonia, for this opportunity. And first, I'd like to tell Linda, thank you for sharing your inspirational stories there. That was great. You know, what I'd like to tell my physical therapy peers is in all my years of taking continuing education classes, the ones where I learned the rhythmic movements and reflex integration techniques have paid off in spades, whatever the term is. It is the most valuable tool in my toolbox. As a physical therapist, every person that's in front of me has some kind of movement challenge, whether it's an individual joint, low back pain, which makes them walk different, or they have cerebral palsy, or it goes on and on. And so all of them have some kind of movement challenge, but it is the best thing for helping improve quality of movement, amount of movement, pain-free movement, and definitely coordination, which of course falls in with quality. And it works across the entire age band. I've used it from newborns to centenarians. It just works with all ages. And when you're in this beautiful, blissful point where you're on a team, where you have the occupational therapist, the speech therapist, and the physical therapist are all trained in this, it is really beneficial to the parent because each discipline can reinforce the movements and the reflex integration techniques, and the home program becomes very solid, very targeted, and the patient really gets the value of it for their global functioning. I really like that. Patient stories, oh, there's so many. Probably my patient that I enjoy the most, of course, torticollis. Treated a ton of torticollis infants, and by far using the reflex integration techniques and the rhythmic movements made it so pain-free and had so much better outcome than the way I was trained to do torticollis with the stretching and all that. By far, that was even in older kids, because you get the kids that were already up and running around that had torticollis, and it's very hard to try to be playful with them and stretch them at the same time, but the rhythmic movements and reflexes, it was so much easier. And then the other group is the clumsy kindergartners that I like to call it. For these kids get to kindergarten or first grade and they're just not thriving on the playground, or physical education classes are a real challenge for them. They're just clumsy and just kind of afraid of the playground equipment. And the reflex integration stuff and the rhythmic movements just help them develop that confidence in their movement patterns, help them be more coordinated, and it just changed their life, and it impacted their social ability, because then they could keep up with the other children. So just can't say enough good about it. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks, Melody. I remember one time we were talking, Melody, and you shared with me that you had one of these clumsy kindergartners. And you said he didn't have a severe diagnosis, but he wasn't able to thrive on the playground because he was scared, physically very uncoordinated. You said he was 5 and he couldn't even ride a tricycle. And you said you started with just the basic rhythmic movements. I don't think you even got to the reflexes yet, if I'm remembering correctly. And his parents did the rhythmic movements with him 5 nights a week for about 10 to 15 minutes. And you said in 6 months he had a huge increase in his motor skills, and you were doing I don't know which assessment it was. I think it was the Peabody one. And it was subtests of the Peabody, and there were subtests of the gross motor skills. And you said he went from, I just took this in my notes today, he started out at 22 to 28 months on one of these subtests, age equivalency, and he jumped 30 months, but the time lapse was only 6 months. So in 6 months, he had a 30-month jump in development, and he went up to 52 to 71 on that Peabody. And you said he learned to ride a bike, which I love that.
Yeah.
Couldn't even get the tricycle.
And that's just a typical story. They just, once they get that, their body gets coordinated and it starts getting wired together correctly, they just thrive. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's so funny. We're used to these. Yeah, I know. And we're used to these stories now because we've heard so many of them. But something that Carrie wrote in one of her emails to me was that she was astounded And that to me is like, that's like the word to describe it. And that's actually what Dr. Blomberg said. He said, there was nothing in my medical training that prepared me to understand how these movements could be having such a big impact. I'll go to Carrie here, and she can share more about why she's been astounded. I want to just share that Carrie is a experienced speech language pathologist, and she has a diverse background in assessment and treatment, also with children and adults. And she got curious about sensory systems and child development, and then she started studying the primitive reflex and neurodevelopmental movements. And she now offers really comprehensive assessment and treatment by combining her knowledge of speech and language pathology with sensory development. So that to me is so exciting, because one of the things that also that Dr. Blomberg said is, he said we commonly see after we give children these rhythmic movements that they start speaking better. Or even if they were nonverbal, they can start speaking, or I guess the better term now is non-speaking, but they start speaking after they get rhythmic movements. Maybe not every single one, but often we see, again, astounding improvements. So, Carrie, please share your experience and what you would tell other SLPs and any stories.
Thank you, Sonia, for inviting me to participate in this panel. And thank you, Melody and Linda. I just am inspired when I hear these stories. So, as a speech language pathologist, I typically see kids for motor speech disorders, language, and social communication. And in my practice, I began to notice that although I was treating these challenges, children were often unable to make significant progress because their systems were in overwhelm. And so incorporating primitive reflex integration and neurodevelopmental movements into my practice has allowed me to support children's physical, cognitive, and social communication development with a whole brain, whole body approach, which is very exciting for me. In addition to outstanding outcomes, and I'm going to tell you a little story, this work has allowed me to feel a deeper connection with my clients and their families, and to experience more fulfillment as a clinician in my work. So one child in particular stands out, and I saw him for about 5 years from the time he was about 4. And when he came to me, he would just wander from activity to activity, stopping only briefly to look, but then move on. So he wasn't engaging with anything or anyone. He used very little language and didn't make eye contact, didn't respond to his name, although it was clear to us that he heard and understood us. One of his greatest challenges was just slowing down long enough to engage with people and activities. So I taught rhythmic movements to his mom right away. And because he wouldn't, be still, we weren't able to do it while he was awake. So she started doing it with him while he was sleeping every night. And the changes that we saw were, I'm using that word, astounding.
Right.
Within about 6 months, he was able to sit with me and engage in an activity. And he started to greet me when he arrived at the clinic. And after about a year, he was smiling and laughing with me. And we discovered that he had a sense of humor, a great sense of humor. His mother started doing short sessions of rhythmic movements while he was awake, and he began to ask for them, which was also amazing to us. And after he was able to be still for short periods of time, I began incorporating reflex integration once he was able to tolerate the sensory work. And today he's 8 and he can sit in a group and he can participate in school. He greets people, he smiles at them, he still laughs and tells jokes. He's a delightful person. And I'm so grateful to rhythmic movements and reflex integration for helping us to access his brain-body connection and his beautiful self. He's my favorite story to tell because of such an extreme change in him.
Yeah. Well, that is really beautiful. And thank you all for such beautiful stories and input. Carrie, I love what you said about how you took a long period of time to work with just the rhythmic movements, and then he could be still and receive the reflex integration. And I'm so glad you mentioned that, because another thing that I learned along the way from experience is that because primitive reflexes involve sensory input. Like if we're going to start integrating them, we need to stimulate them and get them working. But if they didn't go dormant, there's often compensations in place. And so it can be actually uncomfortable for a child to, if you just go right in and do the reflexes. And that's the other thing that I love about rhythmic movements, is because they're so calming and soothing, and they give so much good sensory development that then you see the development in the child, and then you can start doing the reflexes and it's not so jarring. So maybe we could talk more about, anyone who wants to share anything about that or anything else. We can all maybe unmute.
There was one more thing I wanted to share about, because I think speech language pathologists might think, well, I can't do sensory integration. I'm not an OT, or I'm not a PT. But what I've seen is that these techniques and these movements help children get a better sense of their brains and their bodies. And that supports, like some of us were saying, their self-esteem. And it allows them to make more meaningful connections with peers and teachers and caregivers. And it also allows them to step out of the fight, flight, freeze responses that they may be habitually, experiencing the world in, and step into what we call the learning brain. But I just feel that even though speech language pathology might seem like an unlikely profession to learn these movements, they've been just tremendous with my students.
Yeah, and Carrie, I'm so glad you brought that up, because like maybe some SLPs would think like this is out of the scope of their practice, but we do know, and there is solid research, that the rhythmic movements help boost speech development. And when they study babies, they see that the rhythmic movements precede bursts in speech development. And we also know that when the primitive reflexes are not integrated, it is associated with developmental language disorder. So I would think that we could say this is actually within the realm of the speech language pathology profession.
Yeah, I agree. And I also feel that, when we're struggling to control or integrate our senses, we're in our fight, flight, or freeze mode. We're in our survival mode. And so we're not going to learn how to speak or communicate or socially interact with other people and all the nuanced communication that takes place. We're going to be like, I have to be safe. I have to be balanced. I have to be able to see what I'm doing. And so if we can slowly move out of that, then we can open our brains up to speech and language and communication and social interactions and all of that other nuanced communication.
That's great. And then did you find like you were really a great and eager student of this work and applier of this work? Like, do you think, was it pretty easy for you to get the parents to do these movements at home?
I think in general, yes. There are always families who just sort of want the one-stop shopping, drop the kid off and have me work with them. But in general, I don't require, but I strongly encourage families to be there with us, to learn the movements, to practice with me, to practice with their children, and then take it home and practice every day or as tolerated at home. And the improvement is so much faster,
Right.
because doing it once a week isn't going to do that much that quickly.
Right. Yeah, that's wonderful. I would like to say great thanks to all of you. I'm so thankful to have this kind of sharing, because then it just gives me a real boost and a real exciting energy to collaborate and know that we're all sharing like some of the same experiences and things. So that's actually super fun for me. And I trust that this has been very valuable for those listening. I think what I'll do is I will share a few slides, just because I want ones to know that there is really good research coming out about these types of movements. So here's a study that came from Korea, and they used primitive reflex integration activities, and they found that it actually helped improve forward head posture. So the posture got better, the balance got better, and the concentration got better, which I think is phenomenal because, again, when we help somebody with their physical balance, it often will reduce anxiety, which just makes a lot of sense. And there's research about that. So then another set of research is showing that when children have challenges associated with rhythm, again, speech and language disorders can happen, and developmental coordination, ADHD symptoms, and dyslexia. So it covers the whole realm of all the three wonderful practitioners that we have here, right? So the OT, the PT, and the speech are all represented there. But the nice thing is when we give rhythm, we can see improvements in those areas. It's interesting because our ability to produce a smooth rhythmic movement is something that we start working on in infancy. It's so important to our functioning. That's why human beings are designed with these movements in the first place, is so that we can be rhythmic. And it's so important that when it's not there, it's actually used as a biomarker for ADHD. In this study, they're doing, a kind of study where they're asking kids to do finger tapping and measuring whether they can do it or not. And they do find that when there are challenges with rhythm, they're more likely to have the ADHD diagnosis. And then it's good to know, like in this study, they showed that the children got rhythmic movements for 5 minutes a day. And the ones who got it at least 4 days a week, they could measure that their primitive reflexes were integrating. In other words, the retained primitive reflexes was reduced. And then that also went hand in hand with a boost in their reading scores over a control group. So just another reminder that these movements are building the foundation for function. And this is exciting research here. This came out in 2024, and these researchers did a combination of playful movements, reflex integration movements, rhythmic movements, and vestibular movements. It's very similar to what we teach in the Brain and Sensory Foundations course. We teach playful movements, reflex integration movements, rhythmic movements, and vestibular movements. And also, we have protocols to take the stress out of goals, which is really fun. But they got here with this research with a group of children, and this was, I think, over 700 children in this study. So they did a fantastic job, and they did show that not only were they able to promote reflex integration, again, the amount of reflex retention was reduced, and that went along with sensory motor development, auditory, and visual skills. And then the same researchers wrote a paper about how when the primitive reflexes get more mature, it also helps mature the vestibular system, also early school age children. And then we were talking about how this works for all ages. This is a group of elderly individuals, and they were over 60. I'm 62. So anyway, boosts cognitive function and increases well-being. I love that. And they did it in relationship to a control group. And they found that the individuals who participated in the sensory motor activities to integrate reflexes, they had better cognitive function and well-being over the control group. So that's good to know. Thank you. Thank you to our panelists. I so appreciate you guys being here and sharing your expertise and your love for these movements. I love them too. I fell in love with them many years ago, and I've never stopped being excited about them. So to me, that is a huge gift. And I feel like we're all together celebrating this gift. And that means so much to me, and hopefully to our listeners as well. So I want to thank the listeners, and you can find out more information at Move, Play, Thrive. We don't have to go. If you guys want to share more, I do definitely want to maybe put us all up on camera so we can say goodbye and thank you. But anything else that you feel like we missed or that's really important to share, please chime in with anything else you would like to say.
I think Linda brought out such an important point about how portable this is. You don't need equipment, and the parents learn it so easily. It's easily taught, and that's just not the standard in therapy world. Usually, you have to have equipment and special something or other.
Yes.
So, very portable.
And one thing is that, for the parents, talking about the portability, like for the kids that have a hard time regulating sleep-wake cycles, that have a hard time waking up in the morning and wake up real irritable, and like Carrie talked about, how they work on the brain even when the body's asleep. So oftentimes I'll have the parents just wake the child up with one of the rhythmic movements, and the children wake up in much better moods. They're easier to deal with, get dressed, get ready to school, transition. And same thing in the classrooms at the developmental preschools. In our autism room, you'd have the kids that just couldn't sleep at nap time, and they wouldn't stay on their mats. They would wake up the other kids, which was just a major stress to their caretakers and the other children. But the movements would help them go to sleep, and then use the movements to help them wake up peacefully. And so it's just so amazing. And I'm like you, Sonia, I never will cease to be amazed at some of the things that were so hard for me to ever experience in my career that now have become so much easier and successful with the use of the movements.
I'm so happy to hear that. I remember it's so interesting. Like one story leads to another, because I was remembering as we were talking, like, oh yeah, this mother told me once that she had her girl before she went to school. It was so hard for her in the mornings. She would wake up really irritable, and she said she started rocking her with these rhythmic movements in the bed to wake her up. And she said she made huge gains in school that year, and she caught up with her peers in math. And the girls even said, oh yeah, school is so much easier this year. So it's fun. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Sure.
Yeah. All right. Any last thing you want to share, Carrie?
Just thinking about a child that I'm seeing right now, and I was watching him the other day. We do a drawing exercise just for the brain, and for the first time I could see him arrived in his body. It was I couldn't describe what that looked like, but I was looking at his profile and I could just see, wow, there he is. And I couldn't see that before. I don't know how to describe it, but it's just seeing that. I guess that's seeing the connection between the brain and the body is just, it's arriving, if that makes sense.
It totally makes sense. And I am actually getting chills when you're talking about that, because it's like you're witnessing a miracle almost, it's like, wow, that was beautiful. And it's like you see a brightness or more of the spirit of that child or something coming out. And I just love that you're sharing that, because we get to see that. And I love how proud the kids are of themselves when they start to make successes and things like that. That's really another special part of this work.
One of the frustrations I've had with, how we have to justify therapy to insurance companies, et cetera, is we can't measure some of these things we observe, and we can all see them. We know they're happening. We know they're functioning better. Their quality of movement's better, but we can't measure them. And that is so frustrating to justify ongoing treatment or to justify starting treatment, because you can't measure it. You have to measure everything for insurance to pay. And so I hope someday we can measure the child arriving in his body, the person bending over with increased ease and just being more functional in their daily activities, other than, we can check off, yes, they can do the task, but what was the quality? That has been my frustration for a long time.
Yeah. And not only what was the quality, but this is part of that quality picture is how much stress was there. Like, were they able to do it without stress and with enjoyment and with ease? And that's always my goal. I love that you brought up the insurance, because actually I know Linda has something that she wants to share about that OTs often ask about, well, how do you bill for insurance? So Linda, if you want to talk about that, that would actually be great.
Well, I'm in Arkansas, and so we most of the people I see have Medicaid. And when I first started using the rhythmic movements, some of my colleagues would be like, "Well, what modality are you documenting that as?" And I just say it's sensory integration. I mean, it's a sensory integration intervention. And then if I'm writing to third party payers that want more information and they want you to describe it, I just say, it's rhythmic, predictable, tactile, proprioceptive, vestibular input to improve whatever goal I'm working on. Because as Melody and Carrie said, it just helps everything because it helps with development. And then when Melody was talking about the standardized test, when I started using that intervention, standardized test scores increased significantly. I mean, like kids made gains on those standardized assessments that usually aren't the greatest tools of measuring their improvements, as your Melody's been talking about, but better gains than I've ever seen. And so then when Carrie was saying it just makes you feel more fulfilled in your career, like you're making a difference. So yes, I mean, I just document it's a sensory integration or a sensory processing modality. I can get more descriptive with what we do as needed, but it's always for the function of making improvements in the areas that they've qualified for services in. If that
Right.
makes
Yeah.
any sense.
Oh, that makes so much sense. Thank you so much for sharing that.
And then,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt. This is not related to insurance, but what Melody was saying with torticollis and how now she has a painless intervention. I've never wanted to work with babies with torticollis because as a sensory integration trained therapist, I do not like to have pain in my sessions because it's stored in the limbic system. Right. So when I hear of PTs using this, and now the kids can get the alignment they need, they can make the motor gains they need without the pain, and then you're not asking the parents to do a painful intervention to help their kids, so you're working on that parent relationship with the baby and setting the limbic system up for success. So to me, these movements and the reflex integration is just the easiest tool to use and gain success and build trust and relationship and empowerment and self-esteem. And you can document it and you can use it and get reimbursed for it.
Yeah, that's great. Yay!
Exactly. You don't have to do it for free.
Well, please help us, everyone listening, help us spread the word to PTs about the torticollis, because to me, like, I didn't even know until I met Melody that the main intervention is actually painful for the child and the child cries. And I was like, wow, that can't be right. There's got to be a different way to do this. And Melody figured it out, actually. She took some tools from the two courses and combined them and added some other things. And she's the one that figured it out. So she's the brains behind that. I keep telling her that we want her to teach a torticollis without tears class, and someday that's going to happen. We just have to have some volunteer babies. But tell your PT friends, and Melody, I hope that you become famous for torticollis without tears. That's my that's my plan for you. If I had any say in it. And we'll say goodbye from here. Thank you all so much. And have a lovely evening. And thank you guys all for sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Melody. Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Melody. Thank you, Linda. Many blessings. And thanks to all the listeners.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.